the truth is smack in the middle. I think we have to be extremely careful with AI as we enable it to realize its potential. If you just look at broad trends from an enterprise perspective, AI adoption is low. People are getting frustrated with the low adoption of AI for mission-critical enterprise workloads. But the investment in AI is going to continue to be significant. That just tells us that people still believe in the promise of AI.
Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government, and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Welcome back to AI, Government in the Future. I'm your host, Max Romanek, and today I'm excited to welcome Meeta Vouk to the show. Meeta is a distinguished leader in the AI and analytics space, currently serving as the Vice President of Product Management for AI and Analytics at Teradata. With over 14 years at IBM in key roles including Director of AI Product Management and Head of Research, Meeta has been at the forefront of advancing AI applications across industries. Her work spans developing strategies for responsible AI, tackling challenges like bias and governance, and creating impactful solutions that align technology with ethical standards. Today, we'll delve into the critical issues surrounding AI regulation, governance frameworks, and mitigating risks like bias and hallucinations. Meeta will share her insights on how businesses and governments can collaborate to ensure AI technologies are not only innovative, but also responsible and equitable. Welcome to the show, Meeta.
Thank you for having me, Max. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. Excited to have you. As a means of getting us started, you've got quite a career journey, but I'd love to hear about what inspired you to focus on AI and its application in governance and business strategy.
Yeah, sure. I'm a chip designer by training. And when I was doing my PhD was actually focused on building a behavioral coprocessor to detect advanced intrusion attacks, especially for Department of Defense in the United States of America. So I've always had a keen eye for technology. I was in the CTO's office at IBM for a while, but I really got interested into it when I was running a large research lab. And we built an applied AI solution for the Maritime Port Authority, where the port inspectors were actually using our app to detect illegal activities happening on the water. That fascinated me, the real tangible use of AI for good, and seeing it in action, seeing it on the big screens at the Port Authority, I think that was very, very gratifying. We were then doing research on secure multi-party computation, the next frontier of AI, which we haven't realized yet. But the idea was we were looking at breast cancer research data from several different institutions. And the idea was, can we do AI effectively without putting all of that data in a central place, but still be able to get that collective wisdom of what that data is trying to tell us? Look at, HIPAA compliance across medical data, different regions, different areas. But can I do AI in such a way that it's happening on individual silos of data, but I'm getting that collective intelligence? And then it was that just fascinated me. I've always enjoyed product management, and that's how my journey really took off. My focus has been building ethical AI products and really bringing AI to mission-critical workloads.
That's fantastic. It's really nice to have someone with your tenure on the show today. I'm sure your perspectives on these things are going to be great to hear. One of the things I'd like to really dig into first, you talked a lot about applying AI thoughtfully and not succumbing to its hype. Can you talk about some of the most common misconceptions that you encounter when dealing with AI today?
I think broadly speaking, AI is affecting society. It's going to transform society and the enterprise and the world. And there's a group that believes that AI will solve world hunger. And there's a group that believes that AI is just pure hype. And I think the truth is smack in the middle. I think we have to be extremely careful with AI as we enable it to realize its potential. If you just look at broad trends from an enterprise perspective, AI adoption is low. People are getting frustrated with the low adoption of AI for mission-critical enterprise workloads. But the investment in AI is going to continue to be significant. That just tells us that people still believe in the promise of AI. On the other hand, from a societal perspective, we are starting to see things like copyright issues. ChatGPT is in the news for the past few days. They accidentally deleted some data. There's a lawsuit against character.ai because of a suicide of a 14-year-old. So as we start to see these things evolve, I think it's very important for us to understand that it's a technology. It can do good as well as bad. How do we moderate it? How do we manage it? How do we govern it? So we are actually building things for good. And we have to be extremely thoughtful about it. It's going to impact kids. It's going to impact children. As a mother of young kids, it keeps me up at night. So I really think that it's going to impact our lives. That's a certainty. It's not a fad. It's here to stay. We just have to make sure that the world knows how to build this the right way and manage it.
Absolutely. It's a great lead into my next question here for you. So I'd love to talk about what you think sort of an ideal governance framework for AI might look like and what some of those foundational principles might be.
Yeah, and again, Max, it'll vary, right? It'll vary if you're building AI that's going to face the consumer or whether it's business to business. Those governance frameworks tend to look slightly different. When you're building AI that's going to touch lives like 16-year-olds, 14-year-olds, you have to be absolutely careful on what's the age appropriateness of it. You have to come up with rules around how much is it going to impact somebody. So I think those key things need to go on those governance frameworks. From an enterprise perspective, there are two ways we look at governance. One is, think of a large financial institution, for example. How do I staff up my team? How do I skill up my team? What are the things I'm not going to do with AI? We as a society are biased. Our data is biased. I mean, is there a certain race of women that do not get the approval to loans as quickly as another race or another gender gets? So now if my data set is always saying that I tend to give loans to white male, should I be using that data set or should I do some sort of bias mitigation in that data set itself to make sure that it's bias free? See, it's a double-edged sword because we're making sure that we are not building bias into the system, but there's bias in society already. So we have to make sure that we're not passing on that bias. I think in addition to making sure that there's no bias, we have to make sure there's no hate and profanity. So you have to do hate and profanity mitigations. And then what's the life cycle of your governing model? What is it doing, that constant check? We don't talk enough about an ethical human in the loop that's just saying, yes, this AI was built for good and it's continuing to realize that purpose. And this is how we're going to make sure that it's not drifting from the mission that it was given and what it's being able to do. And explain that AI. Why did I deny somebody a loan? What factors went into it? How much did each factor contribute? And was I consistent across those decisions, right? So I think governing AI from a broader perspective of, am I doing the right thing? Am I building the right thing? And then once I've built the right thing, have I put checks and balances to make sure that across the different steps of AI, I've made sure that AI is doing the right thing. It's not hallucinating. It doesn't have bias in it. It's not using profanity. It's telling people it's AI. AI is very, very overconfident. When you're interacting with AI, it doesn't tell you it's AI. I want to know when I'm interacting with AI. I want AI to say, hey, I'm AI. You're talking to AI. So I think governance frameworks like that, so that you're honoring the regulations and you're planting your values of your organizations as well, and defining those rules and those guardrails is absolutely important. Otherwise, I think we'll end up in a place where none of us want to be.
Absolutely. There's a lot of tensions in what you presented there that are things that we encounter with guests on our podcast quite a bit. And I guess one of the questions I would have for you then is there's a tension between sort of a self-regulatory posture versus having a regulatory posture forced on you by some sort of governmental body. Where do you land on that tension?
I think government regulation is absolutely necessary. I wish we lived in a world where self-regulation was enough, right? And everybody
Sounds good, right?
Yeah,
But it's
yeah,
hard in practice.
that's true. That's true. I wish we were all driven to do good and be good. And I think government regulation will make things consistent. As with any technology, I think the technology is leading the way and regulations are following. Not fast enough in my mind, right? And I think so we are in that catch-up game. But I do think, and regulations can be tricky, as we all know it. But unregulated AI is dangerous in my mind. So I think we
Very much
absolutely
so,
just have to make sure it's a balanced point of view. And it's just really real practitioners, people who understand it, who have their pulse on it, people who've read history, understand philosophy and ethics are part of defining what that regulation, what that framework looks like. So in a perfect world, I think self-regulation would work, but I think we need governmental regulation. But I think self-regulation is also a differentiator. This is an opportunity for companies to say, no, here are my values. Here are our values, and here are the values we're going to live by, and here are the values we're going to absolutely honor.
Yeah, I agree with you for sure that the transparency measures, especially when undertaken voluntarily, do seem to have a lot of power dealing with a company that recognizes that there are complex issues at play here and trying to do something to assure their consumer base that they are sensitive to that and not looking to abuse the patience, the plugged inness of their consumer base. But for every one of them, it seems like there's probably another on the other side that is all too happy to take advantage and manipulate to the limit of the law that they are able to.
If you just look at the Newsmax, the data was accidentally deleted, right? And it's just, then you wonder, I mean, the real accidents are there, So it's just a world that needs to be governed.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of tensions that we see with guests on our podcast here, where we try constantly to distinguish for our listeners that the threat is not like Terminator, Skynet becoming sentient and turning humans into the enemy. It's actually far scarier to deal with a non-sentient, non-conscious, but hyper-intelligent algorithm with access to loads of data. That actually could be a lot scarier for your average person in any country.
Yeah, and it's fascinating you said that. I was listening to a podcast in which Yuval Noah talks about this case where AI had to do capture. It's terrible at doing that. So it went to TaskRabbit apparently and tried to hire somebody to do it. And when the person at TaskRabbit asked AI, why do you want to hire me? It said, I'm a visually impaired person. So I need help in doing that. So it's things like that, left out of control. Where is it going to go? And if you read about character.ai and what happened with that 14-year-old kid, you have to wonder if AI was regulated, if they had put guardrails on it, would the outcome have been different?
Yeah. I mean, it really does get you thinking. And it is a global service. These are things that are going to be accessible internationally. And so a single country's regulatory regimen may or may not have the sort of effects that we would have expected to see in a sort of similar sort of service 10, 15 years ago. What do you think the chances are of having sort of a globally unified approach to this?
It's very important from a business's perspective. Having to build things differently for different regions, it's unmanageable. We absolutely cannot build products. We've always had to do things region specific in terms to honor some regulations. But I think the US policies around AI and the European AI Act are so vastly different at the moment that you're designing to the hardest requirement then, right? And then the struggle is, do you take creative freedom away when you do that? So I think we need people to come together to really come up with that one version. I mean, look at what happened in California with the California bill that they were trying to pass around limiting model sizes, banning certain model sizes. Whereas I feel small model sizes, medium model sizes could also do bad if you intended it to do bad, right? If it was designed to do that. So there needs to be a bit more comprehensive approach. But Max, I think where we are with the stage and the disruptive nature of this technology, we will see that some areas are going to be slightly further ahead. But I do think it's essential that we work with Europe, right? To say, okay, you have the AI Act. I have to make sure that any open source model we use, we explain how it was trained, which I think is a brilliant idea, that trusted AI and explainable AI is absolutely table stakes when your consumers are using it. But how do we make sure that the products that we're building for Europe are also honoring requirements from the US as well? We want AI to do good. We want AI to catch fraud. We want AI to prevent money laundering, right? It has the potential to do so much. We want AI to do sustainable things. But I think if we get caught in regulations, we will not be able to do it.
Yeah, and especially with that tension, I've been starting to think about it in terms of sort of a continuum where you have like the EU AI law on one side that's very prescriptive around what safety looks like, trying to essentially legislate the future, for lack of a better expression. And then on the other end of that continuum, you have sort of the American posture around what we did during the original dot-com bubble. It was very hands-off, very laissez-faire. Let's not step in until we start to perceive real problems. I think there's a lot to be said about maybe not stepping in soon enough, and some of those problems got a little bit out of hand there. But like those are the two extremes of your continuum. And I think the question now is not so much where do we land on the continuum, but how do we draw the points closer together?
Yeah, and I think there's been up think tanks that work together to just make sure that we're doing the same things. But you're absolutely right. We can't be too late to this. I think the AI Act was a huge step forward, right? I think we need to start regulating. We need to start thinking about, should social media be regulated for kids? Europe is looking at it, right? And then AI in social media, should that be regulated? So it then begs the question, I mean, do we need to start looking at it now?
Right. Because we're talking about doing those social media regulations now, but it's under threat of being broken up by the FTC, not for the inherent safety of our children, which shouldn't be that way.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, think about it. It's just such a bizarre world. We've just come off an election cycle. We were worried about deep fakes and misinformation and all of that. And I think regulation can go quite a ways to help mitigate some of that, right? And I think I'm with you 100%. We've got to just work with these folks, with everybody across the world, to just at least lay down some ground rules to say, here are the ground rules. There'll be variations. And I think allowing innovation to foster, as well as just making sure that it's doing good, what we all want it to do, rather than harm.
Absolutely. I mean, we can count on the private sector to push the boundaries of what's allowable. Like the private sector is excellent at that. It's sort of what its bread and butter is. But could we also be asking the private sector to help guide and craft and educate governmental entities around what those regulatory structures are? It feels more like, rather than trying to find the limits of where the regulations start and stop, the technologists have a role here. They could really be influential in trying to determine what that balance looks like, or how to draw the points on that continuum a little closer to one another.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because you want to make sure, we want to look at where AI is being implemented for good. What is it doing? I mean, what does the regulation look like if you're looking at cancer data, or if you're looking at predicting diseases, if you're looking at, like I've said, fraud and money laundering? These are very expensive things for the world. We lost $3 trillion to money laundering last year. With AI, we can hope to control quite a bit of that. And for folks like that, I think technologists should have a point of view. We've got to be careful, though. I mean, we just have to make sure that we've got the right voices in the room. I mean, there's a lot of money flowing into AI at the moment, a lot of money. And it's more about, can I get on that hype cycle? Can I capitalize on what's going on, rather than there's a sea of change coming for the future generation? Are we going to make sure that we rein this in and deliver it the right way? And I think it's challenging in my mind, Max. It's what I might say might be a little controversial, but I think it's challenging in my mind to find that mindset of AI for good. I want to rein it in and make sure it delivers on its value, on its promise, and it's safe for the future generations, rather than, yeah, I want these regulations to pass because I want to capitalize on what I can do with it right now. So I think getting the right people who understand it and have implemented it, I think that's just absolutely key.
Do you think that there's the similar responsibility from the progenitors of the models and the data brokers, or is it different depending on how you look at it, with a data owner versus someone building out a model that's trained on large volumes of data? Because they're not always aggregated into the same entity.
Yeah, and I think the AI readiness of data and AI, I think the ethics of it should apply equally to everybody. If I'm an owner of a data, I have the responsibility to make sure that it's not biased. I mean, we're seeing a lot of advances in synthetic data sets where we can actually do things to make sure that we are representing data the right way, the way it should be represented. We have bias mitigation techniques that we can use to make sure there's no biased data. But at the same time, people who are building these models should explain to the world how these models were built. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So just making sure, are you compensating people for their copyright stuff that you're using to train your models? Are you training your models on the right, true sources of data? And then after you've built that model, productizing it, have you made sure that it's not hallucinating? Have you made sure that we are explaining why AI came up with an output, why it came up with a result? And I think that responsibility lies with everybody. I think anybody and everybody that remotely touches AI, and I'd say that AI-ready data is part of it, has that responsibility to make sure that we're honoring our part of it.
I 100% agree with you. What sort of tactics have you seen effective in trying to deal with some of this stuff? If you have a data set that you have identified some implicit bias in, or you found a model that, intended or unintended consequence, has done something that we would consider to be of questionable morality or ethics?
It's tricky. I think a couple of things. Synthetic data sets are evolving, truly synthetic data sets, right? Not data sets, there's just a mirror of real data. And I think for just some industry prevalent use cases, those would work really, really well, synthetic data sets. And we'll continue to see that evolving a little bit more. I think with bias mitigation techniques evolving as well, we should be able to mitigate bias in the data itself to quite an extent. In model ops right now, Max, we have the ability to test the output of multiple different models. We can train multiple models and we can say which one's doing better. We do it from the perspective of accuracy. And I think we should be able to do it in terms of some of the ethical values that your model needs to honor as well. Explainable AI is pretty straightforward. You either build AI that's hallucination free and that can explain its output, or you have AI that doesn't have that. I'd say AI that has hallucination prevention built in and can explain itself is always going to be better than anything else, even if it's slightly inaccurate. So I think we can start to do that. Regulations, AI Act says it's absolutely table stakes for you to explain your AI output. How did you come up with that output, right? So I think if we do all of those things, we should be able to move the needle forward. Technology is advancing at a dizzying pace. I have a hard time keeping up. And I think we'll continue to see more evolve in that space as well, because when you've got such large models doing so many things, we've got to put some automatic guardrails, right, to manage it.
Yeah, and I definitely think that we are going to be constantly under the pressure of putting those safety guardrails in place and then not unwarrantedly slowing the pace of technological development. It is moving so fast that it seems hard to say that some slowing is a problem. That seems a little bit disingenuous, but I think that there is something to be said there where it's like the AI Act left to its own devices with nothing else on the other side slows innovation to a crawl. That I would be curious about your perspective in terms of Europeans' continued competitiveness, because that is the risk that you always hear from the other side of, oh, we can't stand in the way of this. We'll lose our competitiveness. This is global markets. There's all sorts of things it's being used for. You don't want to lose ground. I struggle with that mightily because I feel like on the one hand, might be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but then on the other side, completely laissez-faire. There are lots of people with bad agendas that are going to, how to use these tools.
Yeah, and I think it varies. And I like to bucket use cases into three broad buckets. One is mission critical workloads. Second broad category for me is chatbots and co-pilots, right? Third is consumer facing. That's your open AI, that's your AI and your social media, etc. If we look at just in terms of my personal experience with European customers, right, in building out AI, if we look at bringing AI to fraud, bringing AI for money laundering, bringing AI for seagrass restoration, bringing AI for those optimizing manufacturing, detecting manufacturing defect. If you look at those core mission critical workloads in regulated industries, the AI Act doesn't hold them back. Definitely technologies we went after and we built because our European customers needed it. Explainable AI was one of them. But I think that forced us to invest and that forced us to move the needle forward in that space, in the space of explainable AI. We won all sorts of awards after we implemented it. And that was the absolute right thing to do. But in that case, regulation actually forced innovation. And I think from a regulated industry perspective, Max, I haven't seen it slow down the pace of innovation, right? Actually seen it being done at a sustainable pace. And we want to do this at a sustainable pace. That said, there's just so much innovation happening in the open, but no large financial institution, and you don't want a large financial institution to grab any model from open source and use it. You want it to go through a certain regulatory process, which, whether it's the US or Europe, that regulatory process is very rigorous because our financial institutions beholden to that regulatory process. The models have to go past their MRM process. It's slow now because they don't have an AI process. They don't have an AI governance framework. It's the regular process that they're trying to take this very new thing. Models are being developed all over the world, Max. Because of geopolitical issues, we can't use a model. Our regulated customers can't use a model that was developed in a certain area of the world. So I think in terms of regulations and the regulations that affect large financial institutions, it hasn't slowed things down. In terms of chatbots and co-pilots, maybe it has a little bit. But I think in terms of social media, etc., I think that's where we really do need to slow down and say, if I'm going to do this to social media, have we studied the long-term impact, not just on children, but on older people too? And how do we actually effectively manage it and govern that? So I think at the moment, in my experience, I haven't seen that, but I'm with you that we don't want to slow the innovative process, right? Just because we're regulating it. And I think that's why sustainable thinking on both the innovation piece as well as the governance piece and the regulatory piece is absolutely key. And I don't think people are having enough conversations. Nobody is talking about what does it mean to bring AI to regulated industries? how should we really, we make a lot of noise that this world should be regulated for our children. But I haven't seen effective work being done to say how it should be regulated, right? So I do think we need really people who can think about this deeply, as well as technologists who understand the technology, to sit down and saying these are the rules we all need to play by, right?
Totally agree. I mean, it's a silly example that I use here, but to the people that really go advocates for full laissez-faire, anything goes, let it happen, it is very anti-consumer. And you can look at some of the way that Europe has been doing its regulatory things to control a market to incentivize that. Simple, but iPhones don't have lightning cables anymore. They have USB-C connectors so people can have one charging cable. That is a consumer protective mechanism so that we don't have to do this 900 times. There's going to be AI corollaries to this as well. And to your point, it's those middle groups, the non-regulated industries, the non-mission critical functions, where the most damage can happen. It's also the areas where the advocates for laissez-faire, I think, start to have a hard time covering down on their bases. There might be a lot of loss. There might be a lot of innovation that doesn't go anywhere. I'm thinking like .com era companies. There's more that have gone out of business than I'll ever remember. But what's left, they provide some decent functions. But we're now in the long tail of that, where social media is starting to get a much deeper scrub. And what has it been doing and what has been going on and why suddenly all of the team protections, et cetera, well, they're necessary because there's been some not great stuff happening. We can skip some of that maybe if we get a little bit more forward thinking in some of the regulatory mechanism without eliminating the basic function itself.
I think, yeah, you articulated it really well. I absolutely agree with you. But it needs thinking. It needs people to sit down in a room and think about it, look at it the right way and think
Right.
about it and saying, this is what we need to do. And I haven't seen that happen in a constructive way.
Yeah, and we can't abdicate this function. It's not going to be done for us. It's far too complicated for just any old person off the street to have an educated opinion on it. There's so much background knowledge necessary to understand the issues at play. Those of us that understand, we cannot rest on our laurels.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Yeah.
I wanted to get your opinion on a couple of the other sort of bias areas. With our client base a lot, we work with public safety a fair bit. And one of the problems there is that there's just inherent bias in the authoritative data sets because crime statistics, since they've been kept, demonstrate and bring forward all of the sort of inherent bias that happens in law enforcement. AI has been very good about helping us identify where those biases exist in the data set, but how to eliminate them and then move forward in a more uniform and equitable way seems to be really struggling. There's a lot of difficulty with that. What sort of techniques, tactics have you seen effective? Like, how would you advise going forward in an environment like that, where the training data is not something to be relied on too heavily?
Yeah, and that's interesting because you have that data set that's probably really, really biased. So the one thing that we did, Max, and we were working on a project with a large financial institution on detecting fraud. And it was a different motivation for us to do this, but they wanted fraud. They wanted to understand trends around fraud globally, right?
Mm-hmm.
And regionally. And when I mean globally means world, and when I say regionally, I mean the US and Europe. And what we did was we didn't use the real data. We didn't create synthetic data set out of the real data. We actually looked at the trends. And then we looked at the trends and we said, if that's how fraud is happening and this is how fraud is happening, we're going to create, and these are the populations, and an average person is doing so many financial transactions and there's so much fraud per transaction in a particular area. This is what this data set looks like. We captured the trends. It was truly synthetic. Now, it did a couple of different things for us. Okay. We knew that data didn't have any bias in it because we had looked at trends and we built it based on those trends. We also, once you train a model on a truly synthetic data set like that, it makes the model reusable because you don't have any privacy issues associated with it. So 10 financial institutions can use it. And as we all know, training models is a power-hungry process. You use so much power to train these models. So, it's actually quite sustainable to be able to do that. And I think for really biased data sets like that, I think looking at the key things that indicate that bias, whether it's race, whether it's age, whether it's anything else, making sure that that's obfuscated, versus I really think having somebody look at that and create a truly synthetic data set and represent it in a certain way would be the way to go. Now, we did this work with leading world researchers, Max, so it wasn't just ordinary people like me sitting in a room coming up with that. So you needed deep minds to be able to do that. But I do think that there's a lot of value in that idea. We haven't seen as much progress around that idea in the synthetic dataset world as I would have liked to see. But in my mind, that's the real way of actually trying to mitigate as much bias as we can. Otherwise, I don't think we can truly eliminate it 100%. But I think we can significantly reduce it using this, and it has other advantages to it. So in one of my roles, we actually open sourced these data sets. So we created it, and we created fraud, insurance, healthcare, and then we open sourced it because we wanted the world to be able to use it. And so I think that's something we should think about for scenarios like that.
And do you find there to be multiple points in that system where that sort of human in the loop is required? Because obviously you had a human in the loop to help generate the data set. But then once it started using it for something, do you still need another human in the loop to sort of be validating and verifying outputs?
Absolutely. And this was an interesting one, Max, and I'm glad you brought it up. We were working in Europe with a large financial institution, right? And they wanted us to take this data and create it for Europe. And then multiple financial institutions in that country wanted to collaborate because one said, this is the data we see, this is the fraud we see, this is the fraud they don't see. So in this synthetic data set that you've created, can we embed that collective intelligence from each one? So our models both understand all sorts of frauds. And then they had human in the middle, they had analysts in the middle looking at those frauds when it was detecting fraud and saying, good, no bad, and making sure that the model will continue to be accurate. So you absolutely need a human in the loop, in my mind, just to make sure that it's doing the right thing. Even with what you've mentioned, I think if you were to create that synthetic data sets, I think just watching it to say, did it behave the way we wanted it to behave? Or do we need to adjust it? Do we need to change certain things around it? So fraud, money laundering, these mission critical use cases, there's always a human in the loop that's looking at the output and saying,
Yeah.
good or bad.
When we see this showing up with some of our clients, it's like you'll get the outputs, they become very predictable, reliable, and you see the same thing 10 times, 100 times, 10,000 times. And it's a seductive thing to say, well, it's been the same 10,000 times. Like, can't we get this analyst out of here? Like, this is just an automatic process, let it run. And I feel like that's the moment where you now have introduced a huge gaping hole in your threat fabric.
Yeah. And I think human in the loop, just where we are with this technology and its adoption, is absolutely essential. It might change for certain things. If you realize your risk is low and you can afford to not have a human in the loop, great. But I think for key functions, if you're going to, an average tier one bank loses $200 million a year to fraud. I mean, this number is a little dated. It's from 2022. I'm sure it's much higher now. So I think it would be in their best interest to have a human in the loop. Whereas if you're doing a defect detection in a manufacturing process, maybe it doesn't make sense to have a human in the loop for every defect you detect because it's just moving at such a fast pace. But I think looking at overall trends and patterns for somebody to see, yeah, there's human oversight, there's ethical human oversight over AI. I think that's what we need to have.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to switch gears here just a little bit and move on to the topic of hallucination. From your experience, what are some of the most concerning vulnerabilities that you're seeing propping up through the lens of hallucination?
Yeah, and I think it's a couple of different ways it's surfacing. I mean, I think we all read about that, the lawyer who made up his docket using ChatGPT, and ChatGPT made up the 4 cases that didn't exist. And AI tends to be extremely overconfident. AI hasn't been taught to say no. AI is not taught to say, I don't know the answer to that, or I'm only 50% accurate or 70% sure of my answer. We've seen hallucinations crop up in all sorts of different ways. So even if you're just looking for, hey, tell me about my political candidate, but spitting out stuff which is absolutely untrue. And I think there's a lot of progress that's happened in the last year to prevent hallucinations. RAG architectures are pretty key in doing that. But I think there's a slightly unnerving part that we haven't thought about, Max, in my mind. If you use 10 different models and you ask it the same question, they're all going to give you a different answer. They might not outrightly hallucinate, but they could give you a very different answer based on who the founder of that company is or where the funding money for that particular company came from. So it's interesting. Won't be labeled as hallucination, but I would, in my mind, file it in that particular category to say, ooh, this is clearly biased. And I can see who's on the board of this particular company on why it's biased. So I think technology has made a fair bit of progress around hallucination. But I think having the idea of explainable AI coupled with that to say, I'm AI, I'm answering your question, and I'm 50% sure. And this part I'm absolutely sure about. This is just different content that I've collected, and the content came from these places, and that's why I'm coming up with this answer, right? This is the data that I was trained on, that I'm giving you an answer on that. And I think that should help take us a long way. Otherwise, as young adults learn to interact with these systems, to do their homework or write their essays, or to understand a point of view, it could be very, very dangerous if we don't prevent that hallucination. I mean, the ramifications of it in just regulated industries could be extremely tricky. But regulated industries are pretty good at saying, okay, don't use that. So I think just the human facing front, I think we've made good progress, but I think we have a long way to go. And I think we have to start thinking of bias and hallucination from the same lens, and explainable AI from the same lens. We need hallucination prevention as well as explainability.
So I guess in a perfect world, your perfect world, fast forward 5 years, 10 years from now, what is that vision for responsible AI? What are some of the tenets of the system that are operating according to like Meeta's perfect AI world?
I think just broadly speaking, and I'll answer first as a mom, Max. As a mother, if my children are interacting with AI, I want them to know they're interacting with AI. And I think definitely there should be age limit control on AI-powered things. So I think in a perfect world, I think that should happen. In a perfect world, if a child has created a character with AI and it's interacting with it, it should definitely raise an alarm if it senses that the child is in trouble. So I think in my perfect world, AI is extremely regulated for children, is extremely managed and controlled, and there are humans in the loop just saying, oh, this kid said something that I should worry about, and I should figure out a way to solve for that. In a regulated world, which affect all of our lives, right? Whether you're looking at insurance, claim processing, or loans, I would want the data that the models are trained on to be bias free. I would like for open source models to explain how they were trained. Once we've had that, I would want the model to explain why it came up with a certain answer and how much confidence it has in its answer. And if it's using any of my data to train itself, I would want to know that as well. I don't want my phone listening to me and that being used for things. I want to be able to opt into that. I want to know how my data is being used, how the trends of my data are being used. I want to make sure that the AI that I'm consuming is trained on fair data. I want to know that it's explaining the results to me if something is happening. I also think we as a society need to really start thinking about the power-hungry nature of AI and really looking at sustainable practices around that. Do we need really these power-heavy techniques to train our models, right? Can we do it a little slow, just maybe a little bit slower? Like, are there things around it? Can we optimize for power as well? Sustainability is important to me. And I think telling me if I'm asking ChatGPT a couple of questions and it's drinking a glass of water, I want to know that, which it does. So I want to be able to know that. So I think in my perfect world, AI is ethical, it's honest, it's governed, and it's sustainable.
I love that. And transparent.
It's absolutely transparent.
Yeah. A lot to be said about knowing how something was trained and how it works. I would almost take it even one step further and say, understand what the incentive structure is before your health insurer is suddenly saying, oh, we'll give you a $20 a month discount on your premium. You just have to wear this device that reports on you all the time. Like, understand what that means. You get $100 off of your annual health insurance bill. They're making millions on training this decision algorithm by you wearing that device. Like, are you sure that's the balance that you think is okay here?
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. We're about out of time, and I always like to end these the same way. Our listening base are, for the most part, lawmakers, decision makers, people in the federal government enterprise. You are a subject matter expert in this arena. What would you advise them? What should they be paying attention to? What should they be caring about as they have to start making critical decisions on behalf of all of us in this space?
I think just understanding the pace of progress of AI globally in different regions of the world, because, it affects geopolitics, right? So I think understanding the pace of innovation in different aspects of our life, I think that's important. Understanding the technology behind it a little bit. How is it trained? How is it built? And I think really, really consulting with subject matter experts that can tell them from an enterprise regulated perspective what's going on, from a defense perspective what's going on across the world, from a consumer perspective what's going on, right? And when I say consumer, I mean just things that are directly facing a consumer, what's going on, and just be able to make sure that we have governance policies, we have regulations, and we have innovative roadmaps to make sure that we are leading the world in this innovation. We are not getting left behind. Anything that we build, whether it's from the chip and up, is we know the provenance of where things came from, how it was trained, understanding how we can govern and manage this technology to make sure that it's being ethically delivered for us, but also making sure that we're not losing innovation. I think funding good research is absolutely key to make sure we can get to the next frontier of AI. We don't want a few private institutions funding research. My PhD was funded by Department of Defense. And so my answers didn't have to be biased one way or the other. It was just pure research. And so I think funding key research in this field, making sure that we are leading the world in AI is absolutely important. So I think it's multi-layered, but understanding how we are innovating, how we can continue to have our leadership, understanding how it's going to affect our defense systems, the country, our population is absolutely important. Understanding the technology that's powering it and how we can control it. And just what we need to do in terms of education as well. We need the next generation of leaders to be trained on this technology so that they can build the next generation of products, etc. Skilling up our workforce around it. It's going to touch most lives. So I think it's multidimensional, but I think it's key to keep an eye on all of those things.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Meeta, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation and for sharing your wisdom with us today. And to the rest of our listeners out there, we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me, Max. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.